All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about whole of society. We need to be inclusive. That means everybody, not just the people you like. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, as we close out the end of August, we're getting near the end, my friends. Soon it will be fall, and for our listeners down south in the southern hemisphere, we cracked 58 countries this week, which was pretty impressive. We are looking at you starting to emerge, getting ready for summer. So this is the season of change as we emerge and start going into either fall or spring, depending on where you are on this planet. And we have to think about the different groups of people we have around us. Let's just be brutally honest. We aren't all inclusive. We have beliefs and ideological frames about other members of our society, and it's only coming to a behest and a head. And I think we need to sit back and talk about whole of society and what it really means in the emergency management flavor, in the preparedness flavor, but also talking about everything else in your community life. Listen, we're back from a short break here at Inside My Canoe Head. We took an impromptu couple of days off to deal with some issues around the office. Things happen, but we're back. We thank everybody for your patience. Things are carrying. We're back up and running. And today, inclusion. Listen, inclusions to some people is a very important word. It talks about making sure that whatever sphere you operate in, whatever you do for a living, for community, for donation, to support other people, inclusive means that it is available and accessible by everyone, right? It means that you are doing something that everyone can access. And I'll give you a prime example at the very top level. This podcast is free of charge, right? You can get it on Spotify. You can get it on Apple Podcasts. You can't get it on Google Podcasts anymore because they ditched that. It's available on my website, www.insidemycanoehead.ca. It's available on our parent website, preparednesslabs.ca, and it's free, right? But you need to have an internet access to get it. So is it really inclusive? Well, you can get free internet in different places. So sometimes inclusivity takes a little bit extra effort. It takes a little bit extra notion. Now, this podcast is always going to be free and it will remain free. This is my personal community service. This is what I do outside everything else to provide community service to people and of value. And as long as you keep telling me this is of value, and as long as you keep sending in notes of ideas that you'd love to hear, or you say, you just keep the downloads coming, and that's ever increasing, and we're very appreciative here. We don't get paid. There is no profit motive here, but profit motive is not evil. And when we talk about whole of society and emergency management, often we forget the fact that inclusivity means everybody in society. So today's discussion is going to be about what whole of society means if we're going to address the ever-increasing cost and complexity of disasters in your nation. So I'm in Canada. In Canada, we're seeing far more costly and far more complex disasters. When we think about complex, we mean the fact that they are influencing so many different sectors and spheres of our society, right? And they're involving many different elements of society. It's almost like a polycrisis on the global stage, right? So a polycrisis would be something that has multiple things going on. So you have conflict, you have societal disruption, you have ideological stuff, you have cultural fights. All of these things happening at the same time in the same place means you have a conflict that is the result of a polycrisis, which means you can't simply address it or solve it in a singular fashion. We, within emergency management in Canada and across the spectrum, from those incredible educators out there who are listening to me, and thumbs up to a couple of my very good friends out there who are top of the line, dedicated people like Jody and a few others. we try to provide the best possible service to our population, but we know it's becoming more and more difficult. Now, if we draw a little history here, and we go back, emergency management really was born, as we know, from the civil defense sector. So think about, early parts of the Cold War in the 1950s. The only way for the nuclear weapons to get over here were bombers, right? So we had 6, maybe 8 hours notice that the Russians were going to try to blow us all up, or the Soviet Union, I should say at the time. The Soviet Union was going to try to blow us all up. So the bombers would be flying over northern Canada on its way to the United States, and same thing across Europe. And you would have hours and hours of notice that it was coming. And so great civil defense plans were organized, how to evacuate major cities. There was even a quarter of the city of Calgary was evacuated in a major exercise, and people were brought down a road to receptive communities where they had set up food stations and places for them. And so communities practiced the actual evacuation to get out of Dodge and get out of town, for lack of a better term, before the nuclear bomber showed up. Now, that changed a bit in the 1960s and 70s with the advent of the ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic missile, which meant that time lead went down to 30 minutes. And now it's at exactly 26 plus minutes for that notification from launch to impact. You can't get out of the city. We can't get halfway down the highway on a block day during traffic in 26 minutes. You're not getting out of town. So the idea behind civil defense morphed into protectionist. How do we get people ready for a nuclear conflict? And it's now evolved over the past 40 years to include the ever-present recognition of the impact of other disasters. Now, not natural disasters. There is a great effort amongst the emergency management community to not use the phrase natural disaster, because the idea behind a natural disaster is it places blame and responsibility on nature, right? Nature caused an earthquake. That's why we have so much death and destruction. The educational and professional aspects of emergency management are pushing back and saying, in fact, no, the earthquake itself is not responsible. It's the fact that we build in earthquake zones and that we build structures that are unable and non-resilient to the effects, and thus the destruction is a result of human decisions, not the result of the presence of a natural hazard. So we don't want to use the term natural disasters, because what it does is it allows the civilian to offload responsibility to nature and say, really has nothing to do with me, because guess what? I mean, it's natural. It's a disaster. Nature caused it. Nature caused the flood. They caused the tornado. They caused the hurricane. And so it's not my fault. So that term we try not to use. It may slip out of my mouth every once in a while. And for that, I do apologize. But that's kind of part of the education that we're moving towards. But we understand that these disasters are becoming more and more expensive. Now, there is an argument to be made that they are not more frequent. Now, you can look at the precipitation levels across Canada over the past 30 years, and they're constant. You can look at the area of wildfire burns in Canada, and other than an anomaly last year, they've been trending downwards for 30 years. If you look at the frequency and severity of Atlantic hurricanes, they are constant over the last 30 years. What is happening, very much so in the disaster space, is that they are becoming ever increasingly expensive, almost prohibitively expensive at this point to deal with, and complex. And that is a direct result of the human systems that we create, right? Replacing a 1970s society and a 2024 society is exponentially different in cost. No more frequency of disasters are happening, but what is occurring is that the cost and the impact of those disasters are far higher because of how we've designed our technologically enabled modern society. And as a result, it is exceeding the capacity and capability of our public sector emergency management to navigate. And today I want to talk about whole of society, right? It is a concept that I argue for. I'm going to have the pleasure of presenting at the Canadian Emergency Preparedness and Climate Adaptation Conference in September here in Ottawa, as well as presenting in Banff, Alberta at the Disaster Forum in November with a esteemed colleague of mine, Scott Cameron from Emergency Management Logistics Canada. And we are presenting on the whole of society, on the idea of building social capital and relationships, but it's grounded in the fact that society is made up of 4 spheres. So the society you live in, whether it's local, national, however you want to frame it, there is the civil sphere, which is your residents, that's you and I, the people. There is the not-for-profit sector, which encompasses all of the community service organizations, everything from the Red Cross to, well, maybe not the Red Cross, but Salvation Army, your faith sector, your community, your neighborhood organizations, everything that operates to provide a service to the population. You have your public sector, which is your government, and you have the private sector, which are your corporations. Those are the 4 spheres that make up our society, right? All 4 spheres are resident in our society, and to have an inclusive society, truly inclusive society, we need to include everyone in it. So what has been happening within emergency management over the last 10 years, but maybe 15 years if you want to stretch it back to about 2010, is it's the realization that the cost and the complexity of disasters are exceeding the ability of the public sector to manage on its own, right? Through the 1990s, early 2000s, well, maybe not Katrina. I think Katrina was really the first time we saw a break in the mold that the government could do emergency management on its own. That's when I think we really started to see the crack, and really by 2010 and the earthquake that happened in Haiti that collapsed down and killed 250,000 to 300,000 people, depending on who you believe. We started to see the reality that the government itself is incapable of doing it. Now, it's not a function of the people. I will defend to the end of the world the quality and the dedication and the education and the professionalism of the people who work in emergency management in the public sector in this country, in the United States, and across the world. They are absolutely, unquestionably dedicated to their craft. What they do live in is a world of limitations, as we all do. The capacity, the capability, first of all, is your ability to do a certain thing. I have the capability of providing potable water. The capacity of me to provide potable water is the volumetrics, right? So if I can provide 5,000 liters of potable water as a service, the capability is the potable water and the capacity is the 5,000 liters. And if you understand the difference of that, you realize that the public sector, your government, has the ability to do a lot of things, but there is a barrier, a limitation at which point, and I talked about this 2 episodes ago on the podcast. This is why we're returning to it, because it's very, very important to understand that that's a limit. And this is where we've said preparedness gap exists and you're on your own. But what we have been realizing since 2005, really, Katrina, in 2010, is that there are other sectors of our society, other spheres of our society that have the ability to fill the gap. Now, the not-for-profit sector has been involved in emergency management since about the 1970s, mid-1970s, early 1980s. So they're stalwart, seasoned individuals and organizations within it. So now we're seeing, really in 2010, and this is the data I use from a number of things that I said, is where we've realized we've reached the capacity of the public sector, the civil sector, and the not-for-profit sector, right? Really, 2010 was that point where I will argue we crossed that barrier into those 3 not being sufficient to address the needs of society. The only group that we intentionally exclude to a large part right now is your for-profit corporations. Now, your for-profit corporations have done two things in emergency management in the last 20 years. The first one is they're realizing that their own risk profile as a company has exposed them to these disasters, both the complexity and the significance of them on their corporate operations, right? So on their ability to deliver the good and service that is the core competency of what they do. So businesses have been making pretty aggressive investments in their business continuity programs and their risk management programs to be able to provide some type of protectionism and ability to navigate through the disruption that occurs as a result of these more costly and more complex disasters, right? So if we understand that first the business corporations have been doing that for 20 years, what they've been doing since 2010, the latest iteration and what I think is the most influential one, is they've started to invest in societal support. So you see big companies from Costco to Walmart to Home Depot to big telecoms like Verizon and other companies in the United States have the ability now intentionally invested in community support, disaster response, and recovery operations. So you'll see now that the fastest moving logistics chain in the United States in a disaster is the corporate one. It absolutely dwarfs any capability that rests in the not-for-profit or the public sector. And this is the point that I make in a blog that I wrote on LinkedIn today, that we have to understand that the capacity of the corporate sector in our nation is exponentially greater than anything the government could provide, right? The logistics capability of the North American business sector is even far greater than that of the United States or the Canadian military or the government, right? So their logistics capability dwarfs anything that the emergency management sector could bring to bear if it stays in the not-for-profit and the public resources realm. And this is what's starting to see is that you see, temporary telecommunication systems being put up. Now, the telecommunication systems are owned and operated by private for-profit corporations, but they're understanding that they have a social and societal role to play by getting in there as fast as they can with temporary solutions to reconnect society. So they're doing this at their expense, which is improving to a significant degree the response and recovery operations. You have Walmart moving, hundreds and millions of pounds of equipment and support services to various locations at far greater levels than FEMA or the federal government in the U.S. could do. You see corporations start to play a role. Now, that is an ideological barrier for a lot of people in emergency management. And that's grounded in the idea that there is a thought process held by a lot of people in influential positions that the for-profit motive that corporations have should not be present in the emergency management sector. This is really borne out, and I'll give a recent Canadian example. We know that in Canada, the Canadian government at the provincial level consistently asks for the Canadian Armed Forces to respond to disasters, right? Because they know their capacity and capability to provide services is really quickly exceeded in significant events. So to back that up, they're looking for the Canadian Armed Forces. The main reason they're looking for them is because they're free. It costs no money for the province of Alberta or the province of Saskatchewan or the province of British Columbia to press the button. Now, the federal government, the Canadian Armed Forces, does have those costs readily available, and they've decided as a matter of policy that the Canadian Armed Forces wants to charge the provincial government, but that's a political decision that has to come from the ministry in national defense, and right now they don't. So it's an easy button, right? It's a default. It's a well-disciplined, organized, self-sustaining force that will show up and help you out that costs you absolutely nothing. Of course, you're going to press that button as fast as you can and as soon as you can every time there's a disaster. The next thing they're working on is a national disaster response, humanitarian response force, right? Volunteer. Again, largely free of charge, some training money and some operational deployment money that's required to sustain. But in a large part, they're looking for, if I can't get access to the free military, I want access to the free volunteer system. You start to see that there's a trend in provincial governments, who are the lead. Subnational governments in Canada are by far the lead in emergency management, and rightly so. The last thing you want is the federal government running the show. But from the provincial perspective, they're consistently looking for cost drivers that are low. And I understand that because public sector revenues are not higher. Most taxpayers will tell you they're fairly broke and they don't want to give the government any more money. So dramatic investments into emergency management are never going to happen, right? It competes with healthcare, education, childcare, pharmacare, and everything else under the sun, and it'll lose every time to those. It doesn't matter how many proponents stand up and say, it's 8-1. If I spend $1 today on mitigation, I'll save $16 down the road. I mean, that's great, and you're probably correct, but that doesn't mean any money will ever get spent, because you're talking about taking money off the table for childcare and healthcare, and you will lose that every time. So we know that there's not more money coming into emergency management at large in the public sector. We know these great capabilities and capacities exist in the corporate sector, but again, we get back to the for-profit motive seems to be an ideological barrier. Now, I've done some minor research, and this is very small. It is not a statistically significant sample of research. So I just want to put that up front and be honest. I've talked to a number of corporations, and the model they're looking for is the exact same model that the not-for-profit sector gets. So whether you're Team Rubicon, Red Cross, Salvation Army, there is a model that's used as cost drivers, right? Number one is indemnification, which means when the Red Cross or the Salvation Army responds in support and at the request of the government, they're indemnified for operations, which means recipients of their services can't sue, right? It's huge protectionism. Corporations want the very same thing. The next thing that the not-for-profit sector is given is cost recovery, right? It's not a for-profit model, but full cost recovery. Trust me, there's no squeaking around the edges. Every not-for-profit organization that puts in a bill has their full cost included in it. But they want cost recovery, right? The Salvation Army is not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts free of charge, right? The Red Cross are not going to do it out of the free of charge, right? There is cost recovery aspects there. And the last one is training, right? So we have a model in Canada that's emerging, and we've had one or coming up on the second iteration, I think, of federal government money being available for and they're just looking for pan-Canadian. And I get the idea behind that is correct, because the federal government deals with pan-Canadian. So places like Salvation Army, Red Cross, Team Rubicon, they have the ability to get training money from the federal government to run training programs for their volunteer workforce. Corporations are looking for access to the same quality and level of training because they want their workforce who will respond to disasters. They want their systems that will be leveraged in times of disasters to get the appropriate training. So when you look at that three-triangle cost driver model, that's exactly what the not-for-profit sector gets from the government. That is exactly what the corporations are looking for. I have not spoken to a corporation that's looking for a for-profit model in this space. Corporations that do operate in the emergency management space are for-profit. For example, there's a number of new drone companies that sell or rent drones to emergency management organizations. They're not at cost. There's a profit motive there because, again, if you're going to ask a corporation for their services, right, the corporation has to invest a lot of money to create and train those services. And so when those services roll out, they cost money. And so cost recovery is for short-term disaster response. For long-term services, obviously there has to be a profit motive, because if you don't make profit, you don't reinvest in innovation. And if you don't reinvest in innovation, the services and the goods don't get better over time. So for-profit motive is very present in emergency management. Pretty much every contract that is signed by the government for support is with for-profit, but that ideology remains. And I think it's important to remember and talk about the idea of inclusivity. We use it a lot in our ideological frames in society, talking about ensuring that every member of our society is included, that we don't leave the marginalized or vulnerable behind. And a lot of people think that's the ownership of the word inclusivity. Inclusivity means all parties are present and are seen as valuable. So when we want to have a whole of society inclusive response to the increased cost and complexity of disasters in Canada or any other nation, we cannot do that without the involvement of the corporate sector. They are one of the four spheres of our society. They are residents in our community. Their employees are our neighbors, and they can only be successful when society is operating to the best extent possible. When society is disrupted, when society is under a significant impact, when it is strained, corporations like the rest of us do not do well. So it is in their best interest to have the best possible emergency management system across all spheres. It is their interest as well as a member of our society. So I've spoken to many people who really, honestly, truly, in their heart of hearts, hold that they have to fight at every step the involvement of for-profit corporations in emergency management. I am of the opinion, because number one, I own a for-profit corporation in the emergency management space, that we most certainly have a set of skills and capabilities. Capital, really. It really is best expressed as capital. So capital is something that is useful. It is a tool. So the human capital, which is the education and the skill set, I will argue with anyone that the education, knowledge, and skill set of the emergency management professionals in the corporate sector are just as good as those in the public sector and the not-for-profit. One is not superior than the others, but the corporate sector does not lack in education, knowledge, and skill set, right? It's not owned by the public sector nor the academic nerds, and I can say that as a professor myself. Other capitals that are important are physical capital, so the goods and the services that can be leveraged and bought to deliver. Again, I talked about capability and capacity. What sits in the corporate sector exponentially dwarfs what exists in the not-for-profit and private sector, right? I mean, when you think corporations like Walmart can bring to bear thousands of trucks, and you might get 50 in the public sector, it's not even a comparison, right? So the physical capital that resides in the private sector is exponentially greater. And the last one is financial capital, right? So governments at the federal level have the ability to expend unlimited funds. Well, we've all seen the result of that, but they have the ability to expend unlimited funds due to the printing press of money. When it comes to the private sector, they have significant financial resources that can be brought to bear, which means if I go back to that triangle, right, it's in the corporation's interest to invest their capital in their own emergency management operations, both for the first purpose I outlined, as reducing their own risk management to ensure the continuity of operations. But in the second one, reducing the impact of disasters on society, because that directly affects their ability to be a successful corporation. So they need to have society up and running and working and functioning as best as it possibly can for them to reach their mission. So it is within their interest to invest their financial capital in greatly increasing their ability to be involved in the emergency management space for the increased cost and the increased complexity of disasters that we see. So today's entire argument has been that we need a whole of society response to disasters, and we have some ideological barriers to break. We originally thought that resided simply in the government taking care of things for us. We realized through the 1970s and 1980s that the government couldn't do it itself, and we brought in the not-for-profit sector. That worked to about Hurricane Katrina, really. Some would say Hurricane Andrew. I'll argue Hurricane Katrina. And really by 2010, the general accepted realization was the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, and the population itself was insufficient to meet the needs of the increasing complexity and cost of disasters. And we had to look to the corporate sector to be that final piece to take us over the hump. But today, 15 years later, we still run into ideological barriers that really are pervasive and persistent within the emergency management community. And part of my work that I do in both research and a professional basis is to speak to the need to be inclusive, to speak to the need to include all members and all portions of our society. Because in a modern technologically enabled society, grounded in 10 sectors of critical infrastructure, we can't keep it running without the corporations, and we most certainly can't resurrect it without the corporations. So that is the state of affairs now. So let's adopt the ideology that this really is a whole of society effort, embrace and leverage the capitals available within the corporate sector. And I think, and I'm pretty certain, you will see a different way of dealing with the cost and complexity of disasters in Canada and other places around the world. So thank you very much for joining us this week at Inside My Canoe Head. I'm going to ask you to drop over to our website, www.insidemycanoehead.ca. Have a look around. Tell us what you think. Is everything there that you would like to see? Is there something there that's missing? Is there a topic you would love to have me speak about? There's a contact right at the bottom. Drop me an email at jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. I see them all. The staff around here don't get a chance to get near them. And I answer every one of those directly, even the ones that are less than polite and fairly direct. I answer every one of them. So drop us a line. Tell us how this public service, this free service that we will continue to provide to you and everyone that you share this podcast with, how can we do this better? How can we phrase it better? And how can we deliver better information for you to help you understand the system, to help you adopt preparedness, to help you take responsibility for your outcomes and rock an incredible life and chase your dreams? Take care and stay safe, my friends.